Greetings, metalheads, and welcome to No Nonsense Metal Reviews. I'm George, and today I'm back with another new release review for you. A new album. Well, it's been out for a few weeks now. Taken me a little bit longer to get into it than some of the previous albums from this band, but I will say this is a cracking album indeed. This is Immortal Binding, full length number 14 from UK, or more specifically, I think they're from Halifax in Yorkshire. Absolute legendary death doom band, the mighty My Dying Bride. Now, this album, as I mentioned, it took me a little bit longer to get into than the previous few albums, I will say. Notably, The Ghost of Orion, which is an absolute stunner, released in 2020. This album, for me, is absolutely exceptional, but it only took maybe 1-2 listens to really start, digging that album big time. Before that, we had the absolutely incredible Feel the Misery, absolutely glorious album that was released in 2015. And before that, we had the equally as brilliant A Map of All Our Failures, which was released in 2012. And I will say, My Dying Bride have been releasing consistently brilliant albums for years and years. I personally don't think there is a bad album in their catalogue. As I say, there's 14 studio albums. There's one which is a little bit of a, I guess it's a sore thumb. It's a little bit of a different album, which is 34.788% complete. I can never quite remember the last few digits after the decimal with that album, but that was a very experimental album. I personally still think it's an underrated album, as I've done a review on that particular album as being quite underrated. There isn't a bad album in My Dying Bride's discography. Not for a second. There are some albums that are just a little bit better than others, but I do honestly feel those last 3 albums prior to Immortal Binding have been of such exceptional quality that Immortal Binding has had a little bit of a tougher time in kind of making that initial big impression and living up to very high anticipation and expectations. That said, after a few listens, it's certainly grown more and more on me, and I have to say I think it's a fantastic album. There is a lot of notable differences though, and of course we don't want any band, but of course a band as creative and dynamic and experimental at times as My Dying Bride, we don't want them to stagnate. Yes, we want death doom. Yes, we want it to be heavy. Yes, we want it to be melancholic and mournful. Yeah, we want all of those things, but we don't want it to be just a replication of Turn Loose the Swans or A Map of All Our Failures. We've already got those albums. So what I would say is that although Immortal Binding might take a little bit more work to get into, it's a unique sounding, really revitalizing, freaking good album. So, the few notable things about it, what I will say is that it's very, very memorable. It's got a very unique sound that is really quite different to those previous albums. Certainly the last 3, if we take those as a good indication. Overall, this is considerably heavier in my opinion, although no discredit to any of the previous My Dying Bride albums. They've all had very heavy moments, but this album, it kicks off with a track entitled Her Dominion, which is outright death doom. There is no clean vocals from frontman Aaron Stainthorpe there. It's all growls, snarling, gargling death growls, and it's rhythmic, hypnotic, mesmerizing, chugging, dirgy riffs. Really thick, prominent rumbling bass tones there, and hypnotic drumming. Absolutely calculated. Beautiful stuff. It's an excellent track, but it's one of the heaviest songs that My Dying Bride have produced since an album like A Line of Deathless Kings, which is notably heavier than the albums preceding it, and actually quite a bit heavier than the albums that came after. But it's a brilliant album, although I would say that Immortal Binding is definitely heavier, definitely more on the death side throughout, and it's characterized by a greater reliance on Aaron's death growl vocals and certainly crushing riffs than some of the previous albums, and certainly more harsh vocals than cleans. Aaron Stainthorpe is a great vocalist. When he does sing and does the clean vocals throughout the album, it's very impactful. I do think that there's maybe a little bit of a dull tone to his vocals when he is doing the cleans on this album, but that could just be the mix, as he is still a very, very good singer. I don't think there's any deterioration in quality of his singing, but I think maybe it's something to do with the mix or the generally quite dirgy tone of the album. That said, although it's a very heavy album, it certainly retains a lot of the melancholy, a lot of the doomy and almost gothic kind of vibes that we know and love My Dying Bride for. So, definitely different, definitely darker. There is a definite darkness to this album, and let's face it, My Dying Bride are not a bundle of laughs. With albums like Feel the Misery, you're not really going to be expecting absolute giggles. We've also got A Map of All Our Failures. It's not very positive stuff. So you're not going to come to listen to My Dying Bride, certainly with a name like My Dying Bride, expecting upbeat, jolly, power metal, pirate metal, giggles. You're not expecting that. You're not expecting to have a really good time. What you're expecting is passionate, emotive, genuine, deep music that makes you feel. But even in comparison to their own dark, deep music, Immortal Binding is a fraction darker. Definitely darker and certainly deeper. I know in a way it's a concept album. I'm not actually all that familiar with the concept. I'm just more familiar with the music. But we had the second track, one of the lead singles, Thornwick Hymn, a choir of sorry girls, which is very heavy. The riff is absolute chugging, barrage riffing, the drum works and the drum patterns. It's hypnotic stuff. It really is. Fantastic drumming as well. And actually, I believe we had the return not that many years ago. Drummer Dan Mullins, who had been away from the band for a while, but I believe had previous presence behind the throne there, or on the drum throne behind the kit. The Thornwick Hymn, very heavy track, but Aaron's bringing out the clean vocals. It's very mournful. It's actually very quite gothic. Then we get third track, The Second of Three Bells. Again, I believe that was a single, and that is a much more akin track to the sort of material that we were getting on Feel the Misery, Map of All Our Failures, and The Ghost of Orion. That's in a little bit more familiar territory. Kind of has that more resonant sound there, but it's a superb track. Absolutely love the use of the violin. I think it's absolutely stunning, and that's one of the real things, the characteristics that's so identifiable and recognizable with My Dying Bride's music, is that absolutely stunning violin work, and it really does show on certain tracks throughout this album. And violins are courtesy of Sean McGowan. Very talented individual. Absolutely lovely work there. Then we get Unthroned Creed, which is it's a heavier track, but it's incredibly dark. One of my favourite tracks from the album, and the longest track, clocking in at over 11 minutes long, I believe, is The Apocalyptist, which is track number 5, and it's a beautiful track. Stunning vocal work from Aaron. The whole band's on fine form. I really do, like I said, I really do love the prominent, thick, rumbling bass tone there. It's absolutely stunning stuff. but the chorus is so memorable and it's so emotive. It really does get you right in the core. It's absolutely fantastic stuff. That's one of the tracks that even from the first listen, you're hooked and you're remembering it. It's absolutely brilliant. Then on to A Starving Heart, which again, it flows very, very well. This whole album, I will say, is that all the tracks flow into each other very well. There's real consistency there. There's no sort of interlude pieces or anything like that. It's just one track seamlessly flowing into the next. A Starving Heart and Crushed Embers, again, they are littered with very memorable vocal moments and great riff work. Very catchy stuff, but incredibly dark, very emotive, very powerful, but also it feels very genuine and very honest. And I know from reading things after the release of Immortal Binding surrounding the cancellation of live performances, the band had a very difficult time in creating and recording and producing this album. I know there was a lot of tensions within the band, things were coming to a head maybe. And again, I don't know too much about that. I'm focusing on the music here, but I get that feeling from the music, that bleakness, that kind of, you can almost feel the struggle that the band was facing and going through in trying to produce this album. But nonetheless, although it is heavier, darker, notably different to the absolutely fantastic previous, certainly 3 albums, but even going back to albums like For Lies I Sire, they are absolutely brilliant. There's no bad albums in My Dying Bride's catalogue. So I feel with subsequent listens, because it does definitely need subsequent listens, I think that Immortal Binding is just as good as those previous albums. I feel it's just quite different and it does take a little bit of working on. It takes a little bit of patience and perseverance, but with a band as fantastic as My Dying Bride, and they are an absolutely fantastic band, exceptional band, they deserve the patience and deserve the praise, because it is death, doom, gothic brilliance. Absolutely stunning stuff. One of my all-time favourite bands. They certainly sit in my top 5 bands of all time, which is, little spoiler, something that I am in the process of producing for a future review. But My Dying Bride, Immortal Binding, album number 14, continuation of excellent form and quality. The whole band sounds good. I do personally feel there's maybe a little of a bit of a dullness in the mix there in the sound, but that said, it's not a massive turn off. It is not a massive issue. It's just the way it is. This is the final product we've got, and it's a very good one at that. So, my friends, what are your thoughts and opinions on Immortal Binding, My Dying Bride, the sound of the album, the tracks, the struggles? What are your thoughts and opinions, my friends? If you haven't heard it, or you haven't heard My Dying Bride, then I would certainly recommend delving back through any of the albums in their back catalogue, any of the ones previously mentioned. I would personally recommend starting with an album like A Map of All Our Failures. Certainly some of the more recent albums have been of impeccable quality. But if you haven't heard Immortal Binding yet, then you need to check it out. In particular, you're going to want to check out Her Dominion, just for its extremely heavy sound. I'd probably say the second of 3 Bells and The Apocalyptist. All brilliant, but 7 tracks in total. Around sort of 54, 55 minutes in length, so it's a big commitment, but it's all worth it. Absolutely. Aaron and the gang are on fine form. So, my friends, what are your thoughts and opinions on this album? As I say, if you haven't heard it, do check it out. But thank you very much for watching. Please do feel free to like, subscribe, share, comment. It's all very much appreciated. Thank you for the continued support. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Until next time, stay heavy.